They said his exile was deserved. They said so many things. And I, with my mouth shut and eyes trained not to betray emotion, learned to listen to lies dressed as honor, repeated until they became truth. My name is Thalina Mirelang, daughter of a name that still commands reverence in marble corridors and meetings with expensive wine. But that name was always a prison with invisible bars, where even the air had to be breathed with poise. I was raised to be a symbol, not a person. My destiny was mapped out before I could walk. Debut at 17, study where the Mirellans have studied for generations, marry someone who wouldn't see me as a woman, but as an alliance. And for years I was exactly that, the perfect heiress. The portrait of a dynasty sold as unquestionable morality until he appeared. He, who didn't have a weighty surname, but had something I'd never seen in anyone around me, truth. The way he looked at me wasn't with reverence or desire, but with a challenge, as if he were saying, I see who you are beneath that mask. And he saw. He saw the girl bored with ballrooms, the young woman suffocated by inherited jewels, the whole woman no one ever allowed to bloom. I loved him with haste, with anger, with fear, but I loved him with everything. And that was enough for him to be torn from my life with the coldness of someone disposing of an inconvenience. They accused him of treason. They fabricated evidence, spread rumors. I tried to scream, tried to fight, but no one listens to a princess when she's crying, only when she smiles. And they made me smile. They sent me away. They told me it was for the best, that one day I'd be grateful. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, not as a martyr, but as a beacon. Because when you love someone with your soul, time doesn't erase, it only transforms. And now, after years of hiding behind what was expected of me, I've returned. Not because I was invited, but because I chose to return. I came back as a woman who has lost everything and still stood tall. I came back to see what remains of him and of me, and to finally understand if what was born between two reckless youths still lives in the scars we've carried alone for too long. They said everything would be the same, the house, the city, the imposing facades, but they forgot to mention that it wasn't the world around me that had changed. It was me. Walking back through the streets of my adolescence was like crossing a shattered mirror. Every corner reflected a version of myself I no longer recognized. I saw the old bakery where he stole smiles and pretended not to notice when my fingers brushed his across the table. I saw the school gate where he waited for me even when he had no obligation to be there. And I saw the eyes of the people, the same as before, but with a new glint, or perhaps just more cynical. They looked at me as if I were a legend, as if my return were a scandal foretold, an unexpected chapter in the drama they never let die. Returning to the Mirellan mansion was another wound. The house still exuded that mix of tradition and secrecy. The same heavy curtains, the same furniture no one uses, the same portraits of ancestors looking down, as if at any moment someone might make a grave mistake. My mother wasn't there. She's always absent when things get complicated, and my father. My father received me as if I'd left yesterday. A dry kiss on the forehead, a comment about my appearance, and no mention of what happened. That's how he deals with everything, by erasing. His name still carries weight in elite circles, but within these walls, he seems smaller, like a man who knows the castle is crumbling, but prefers to rearrange the silverware. I stayed there for days, not knowing where to begin, pretending my return was about the family's debts, the silent crisis they tried to hide from gossip columnists. But deep down, every step I took was an attempt to find him, or to know if he still wanted to be found. And then, one ordinary afternoon, I saw him. It wasn't a cinematic encounter. It was simple, cruel even. He was across the street, leaning against a lamppost, talking to an older man selling fruit. He wore simple clothes, his hair longer, a scruffy beard, but the same eyes, the same. The ones that stripped away all my lies when I didn't even know I was living one. My heart faltered, literally. For a moment I couldn't breathe, and he saw me. He didn't look away. He didn't come closer. He just looked, and in that look everything fit. The old love, the abandonment, the anger, the memory. I wanted to run, to cross the street, but my legs, traitors, stayed, and he just turned his face and walked away. And that's when I understood. He was no longer the boy who loved with promises. He was the man who survived my absence. And now it was up to me to decide if I was strong enough to face what still existed between us, even if he never said a word. That night, the silence in the mansion was different. It wasn't the noble, calculated silence that fills the corridors like an ancient perfume. It was the silence of something that had broken inside me, and there was no point in hiding it anymore. I sat on the floor of my old room, still decorated, as if I were 17, surrounded by memories that now felt like objects in a museum no one visits anymore. And I cried. Not the restrained crying that good manners teach you to disguise. I cried like someone releasing years of stifled words, like someone who no longer owes explanations to portraits on the wall. Because seeing him, even for a few seconds, was like opening a window in a room sealed for too long. The air was heavy, but necessary. I had returned believing I could maybe help him, justify my absence, perhaps even explain that everything was beyond my control. But that look didn't ask for explanations. It said, I lived without you, and I keep living. In the days that followed, everything that was once a disguise began to burn inside me. The social events where I reappeared as if nothing had happened, the dinners with important names, the conversations about investments and public images, it all felt empty. I found myself trying to remember the exact moment I stopped being the author of my own story. And maybe that's when something in me began to change. I started walking through places I would never have stepped into before. I entered simple cafes, sat on park benches, listened to conversations that didn't come with political agendas. I wanted to hear the real sound of the city, the one that lives on the margins of the Miralan's golden ballrooms. That's how, by chance or fate, we crossed paths again, this time closer. I was in a warehouse that had been turned into a cultural center, something he himself had helped build with the community that embraced him after his exile. He didn't see me right away. He was on stage, reading a passage from another author's book with a steady voice, but full of pauses, as if he chose each word with reverence. And when he finally saw me at the back of the audience, his eyes didn't waver. There was no anger, no tenderness, just a silent acknowledgement. You actually came. And in that moment, without a single word exchanged, I knew the end of our story wasn't written. Because love, when it's real, survives even absence. But starting over requires courage, and I was ready to find out if there was still space for us among the ruins of what we once were, and the possibilities of what we could become. He didn't seek me out, not after that day at the cultural center, nor in the weeks that followed, and I understood. Maybe he was waiting for me to give up, like everyone expected from the girl who once wore gala dresses to hide her own fear. But I didn't give up, because now every street he walked carried not just memories, but questions, and I was no longer afraid of the answers. I started showing up in the same spaces as him, not out of pursuit, but out of a need to breathe the same air. I talked to people close to him, listened to stories, heard how he had helped rebuild homes after the storm 2 years ago, how he organized gatherings for marginalized youth, how he smiled little, but listened much, That man was a silent revolution. And somehow, he was still the same boy who made me laugh when I thought everything around me was a gilded prison. The third time we truly crossed paths, he spoke. It was brief, almost harsh. "Why are you still here, Thalina?" And the way he said my name, as if it carried too much weight to be spoken, made my chest ache. I could have said anything, that I came back for the family, for obligations, for myself. But lies always sounded too loud between us. So I said the only thing that was true, because I never really left. He looked at me like someone hearing something they don't want to admit, but that echoes where it still hurts. He didn't respond. He just watched me with that silence that, between us, always said more than words. And then he left. But for the first time, he left the door ajar. That's how we began to find each other again, through the cracks. In brief conversations, glances that lingered longer than they should, silences that were no longer walls but bridges. He didn't make it easy for me. Every truth he shared came with thorns. He spoke of the exile, the shame, the anger he felt towards me. And I didn't try to justify myself. I just listened. Because sometimes loving again requires first hearing the pain that lingered. One night, sitting side by side on a wooden bench behind the centaur, he asked if I thought it was still possible to rebuild something on ruins. And before I could answer, he added, "You were my beginning, Thalina, but you were also my end." I took a deep breath, holding back tears, and said what my heart had known for a long time. Maybe what we were needs to die, so that what we can still be has a chance to be born. And in that moment, the silence that once separated us began to embrace. The reunion wasn't a fairy tale. There were no kisses in the rain, no promises at sunset. What there was rawer, more real, like everything that survives time and pain. Our steps didn't rush towards each other. They approached with caution, like those who know what it is to lose and aren't willing to risk on impulse. But day by day, he and I let the past stop being an open wound and become a shared scar. Not because we forgot, but because we were finally ready to remember without bleeding. We began walking together through places we once avoided. He showed me the corners of the city where he'd built his life with his own hands, far from the ballrooms where he once saw me smile with my lips while crying with my eyes. And I showed him, without needing to say, that I was no longer the girl who bowed to her family's voice. Being by his side wasn't a romantic defiance. It was a conscious decision. Choosing him now was an act of identity, not rebellion. But it wasn't enough to just be with each other. The world around us hadn't changed that much. When my family learned I was close to him again, the castle collapsed for good. My father called me to talk, and this time, he didn't use euphemisms. He said plainly that I was tarnishing the Mireling name, that everything we tried to erase would be revived, that if I wanted to keep carrying the surname, I'd have to cut all ties with that man. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just listened. And for the first time, I saw my father as he was, not the invincible giant of my childhood, but a tired man, afraid of losing control over a story that was no longer his. That night, I returned to the countryside house where he now lived and found him in silence, as always. I sat beside him and without looking directly said, "They gave me a choice." He didn't respond. He just stared at the fire in the lit fireplace, as if he already knew. "If I stay with you, I lose everything," I said. He turned his face slowly. "You won't lose everything. You'll lose them, but you'll gain yourself." And in that moment it all made sense. I no longer needed to choose between love and duty, because the only duty left now was to myself. Deep down, loving him again was easy. The hard part was defying the entire world for that love. But in that moment, I already knew you don't live a whole life to please portraits on the wall. I was ready to burn the palace, if necessary, to build something new from the ashes. The next day, I gave back the Mirellan name, not with scandal nor with fiery speeches, but with the same serenity my father once demanded of me to obey, now used to disobey with dignity. I handed over the documents, left the keys, signed the renunciations. Not a single tear fell, because when you spend too long pretending to belong to something that corrodes you, there comes a time when even goodbye feels like liberation. And that's what I felt. Freedom. Raw, unexpected, pure. I didn't cry as I walked out the front door. But when I reached the street and felt the wind hit my face, I cried everything I'd held back for years. I cried for the girl I was, for the woman they almost didn't let me be. And I cried for him, for us, for having been separated by forces that didn't understand that love, when it's true, survives even under rubble. I didn't go to him right away. I wanted to arrive not as a plea, but as a choice. And when I didn't bring suitcases or prepared words. I brought only myself. And that was enough. He looked at me like someone who was waiting but didn't expect, like someone who never wanted to force me to return, but always kept a corner for me in case I came back of my own will. I said, I chose you, not on impulse, but because it's with you that my soul breathes again. He didn't smile right away, but his eyes said everything. And then, as if time hadn't passed, or maybe because it had passed exactly as it did, he simply opened the door, and there began the rest of our story, without castles, without crowns, but with solid ground and hands held. We started from the beginning, with respect for what we were and love for what we could still build. We didn't bother announcing anything to the world. Life was already noisy enough. The love we had left was chosen silence, constant presence, gentle truce. We didn't have wealth, but we had courage. And with it, brick by brick, we rebuilt a home where the exiled stopped being a legend and became a presence, and where the princess, at last, learned that abdicating can be the most real gesture of all. The beginning of our new life was simple. So simple that sometimes I caught myself smiling just for living something so far from what I was taught to desire. There were no gala dinners, no imported flowers, no servants walking silently through corridors. There was coffee brewed fresh, clothes hung out in the sun, tight budgets, and unexpected laughter in the middle of tough days. He, who was once exiled as a threat, was now respected as a leader among the invisible, those who build the city, with their hands but rarely have their names remembered. And I, who was once trained to smile with poise, now smiled with my eyes. I learned to cook, to plant, to care for things that can't be bought. I discovered there's immense beauty in what's real, and that love, the true kind, is built in routine, in small gestures, in shared silences. There were difficult days. Renouncing the surname didn't erase its shadow. Journalists still tried for headlines. Old acquaintances still whispered. Some tried to convince me to return, to correct the mistake, to save the name. But I no longer belonged to that world. And little by little, the voices faded, replaced by others, simpler, more human. We began turning that old cultural center into a shelter for aimless youth, for women with no way out, for stories with no stage. And there, among walls that once heard pain, we began to write something else. Healing. He was different, quieter, steadier, but never distant. With me, it was as if time had turned back, just to give us back what was taken from us. Sometimes he looked at me when he thought I didn't notice. A look full of tenderness mixed with disbelief, as if he still wondered how it was all possible. And I wondered too, how we survived, how we found each other, how you love someone again, knowing exactly what it costs. But the answer was always the same, because it was worth it. Over time, the wounds began to heal completely. Not just ours, but those the world around us carried. The people who once looked at us with reservation began to see beyond the stories told at dinners and in old newspapers. There was something in us, not grandiose but true, that unsettled those who lived for appearances and at the same time sparked hope in those who had stopped believing in new beginnings. The cultural center grew. It became a music school, a sewing workshop, a listening space. And every time a new person walked through those doors seeking shelter, I remembered the day I met his gaze again for the first time after the lost years. It was as if, by welcoming others, we were also continuing to welcome each other. Of course, not everything was peace. The past knocked on the door from time to time, disguised as a memory or as people who hadn't learned to move on. I had to see my name in sensationalist columns. I had to hear lies told with the same certainty they once used to spread invented truths about him. But now none of those voices had power over me, because everything we built stood firm. And it was more solid than any palace that rejected me when I chose to love a man who wasn't on the list of acceptable heirs. And about him, he started writing again. Few people knew, but before the exile he wrote poems. He kept them in hidden notebooks, like someone afraid of being too sensitive in a world that demands strength all the time. Now, he left the notebooks open. I read them sometimes, in silence, and smiled. One day he wrote a simple verse I'll never forget. She didn't return to my embrace. She returned to be my home. And that's exactly what it was. Among all the turns we took in the world, we chose to stay. With each other, and with everything that life, imperfect and unpredictable, could still offer us. The last few months have been about building. Not just the walls of the shelter, the new rooms, the small gardens we planted with the community's children, but us. We built a life without a set, without a script, without an audience. And that's what made it all so true. I used to believe happiness was something grandiose, a rare event, a movie climax with a soundtrack and slow-motion tears. But I discovered with him, in the light touch of a hand seeking mine at the end of the day, in the sound of laughter that escapes between one recipe mistake and another, in the way our silences no longer hurt, that real happiness is subtle, almost invisible, and absolutely indestructible. The last time I stood before my childhood home, it was by chance. We were going to visit an old professor of his, and we passed by the Mirelan Street. The mansion was the same, imposing, silent, full of memories that no longer belonged to me. He looked at me, perhaps expecting some sign of pain, or nostalgia, or hesitation. But all I felt was gratitude for having left, for not staying, for choosing a love that didn't need to be perfect, just present. And I moved forward with the lightness of someone who no longer owes anything to anyone except their own truth. Years have passed. The headlines changed, the faces aged, the voices once full of judgment have become echoes. But we remained. We grew old beside each other, not as those who resist time, but as those who grow with it. Life gave us little of what they call success, but everything that truly matters: peace, purpose, love. Today, I write these words from the porch of our home. Surrounded by plants I grew with my hands and books I chose with my heart. He's there, beside me, scribbling another poem in silence. Sometimes he reads to me. Sometimes he doesn't need to. Because when two souls recognize each other, even silence becomes a language. If someone asks who I was, I'll say, I was a princess by blood, but I became a woman by choice. And I didn't return to the throne promised to me, but to the arms of the man who, even in exile, never stopped being my home.